The headset was still warm from her ear when Vera's hand slid under the hem of my blouse from behind, palm flat, fingers spread, and completely still against the small of my back. I did not move. The base of my spine went incandescent before the rest of me had processed what was happening. Her hand did not ask. It simply arrived, warm and certain, and the part of me that had been carefully cataloging every professional reason this would not happen apparently filed its resignation on the spot, because my spine curved backward, small, involuntary, unmistakable, pressing into that warmth. She let the silence sit. 4 seconds exactly. I counted them the way you count seconds in a room with no oxygen. Then, "You've been waiting for me to do that." Not a question, not an accusation, a timestamp. If you want to hear uncensored too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you're watching from and subscribe. 3 weeks earlier, I arrived on a Tuesday with a hard drive, a signed contract, and the professional composure of someone who had been briefed by 2 separate people to manage Vera's silences. The first person who briefed me was the production coordinator, a meticulous woman named Dara, who delivered her warnings in the tone of someone who had survived something and was choosing her words with the care of a woman constructing a bridge. She said, "Vera does not do small talk. She does not explain her decisions. She will sit beside you, not across from you, because she finds the desk as a barrier inefficient, and you will need to decide very quickly whether that bothers you." The second person who briefed me was the editor who had the job before I did, who I reached by phone and who took 3 seconds too long to answer when I asked why he had left. He said it was a creative difference. He said it in the voice of a man describing a natural disaster as inclement weather. I took the contract anyway. The figure at the bottom of the page was the kind of number that makes a freelancer's nervous system override her better judgment, and besides, I had seen Vera's work. Everybody had seen Vera's work. You did not turn down the chance to be inside the architecture of it, even if the architecture had a known tendency to rearrange whoever walked through it. The edit suite was already cold when I arrived. The monitors were already on, 3 of them stacked vertically, casting the kind of blue-gray light that made the room feel like the inside of a thought in progress. The space smelled of cold coffee, and something older, something that lived in the walls of a building that had been a warehouse before it was a production house, a residue of industrial purpose that the renovation had not entirely erased. The city was audible only as a low, continuous hum through the sealed glass of the windows, 17 floors of converted warehouse between us and the street street might as well have been another country. Vera was standing at the window with her back to the door, jacket on, hands clasped behind her. She did not turn around when I knocked. She said, without inflection, without the courtesy of eye contact, "Sit. I'll get to you." I sat. In the 40 seconds before Vera finally turned, I cataloged the room with the thoroughness of someone who has learned that the details matter more than the headline. The editing station had a single chair, mine, and against the wall, a second chair, identical, had been positioned not across the desk but beside it, angled at the same angle as the first, as if someone had decided that the configuration of 2 people facing the same direction was the only rational approach to collaborative work. There was a physical notebook on the desk, navy blue, its cover unmarked, a wired headset coiled, a mug on the left side of the desk that I was almost certain was not mine, because I had not yet set anything down. I made a note of the mug and filed it in the growing category of things in this room I did not have enough information to explain. When Vera turned around, I understood the first briefing with my body before my mind had assembled the sentence. She was tall in the way that is not really about height. It was something in how she held herself, a quality of vertical attention, as if she had decided at some point in her life that gravity was a suggestion worth considering, but not obeying. Her hair was jet black, worn in a severe low chignon, and there was a single strand loose at her jaw that moved when she moved and that she never fixed. Not that morning, not in the weeks that followed. Her suit was black and tailored to the specific geometry of someone who understood that clothing was a form of argument. She wore it the way she stood, as a position already taken. She looked at me. Her eyes were dark, not dramatically dark, not the kind of dark that announces itself, but the kind that simply does not give anything back. She looked at me for slightly too long with the focused patience of someone completing a calculation, and then she said, "You cut the Aldrich film." I said, "Yes," she said. "I know, that's why you're here." She sat beside me, not across from me, beside me, pulling the second chair forward with one hand until the geometry of the two seats was exactly identical. Two people facing the same three monitors at the same angle. And she opened the project file, and for the first hour, she never said anything that wasn't about the work. It was, I would later understand, a form of generosity. It was also the most effective thing she could have done to make me feel the absence of everything else. The work itself was extraordinary. I had known this from her films, from the way she held a scene at the edge of its own meaning until the audience understood something they hadn't known they were watching for. But being inside the dailies was a different experience. The footage was from a film about two women in an apartment over a long winter, and there was a specificity to the images that I recognized as belonging to someone who had thought about every frame, not as a problem of aesthetics, but as a problem of truth. What was true about this person's face in this particular second? What was true about this light and what it did to the shadow at the collarbone? Vera made her notes in the blue notebook while the playback ran, quick and precise in a handwriting I could not read from my angle. Not just that it was small, though it was small, but that she kept the angle of the page deliberately oriented away from me, a fact I noticed on the first day and continued to notice every day after. She was, it turned out, impossible to read and impeccable to work with. Those two things were not unrelated. The headset became the first problem on the third day. It was a practical object. The playback on the monitors had no external speakers during fine-cut work, Vera's preference, she said, for reasons she did not explain, though I suspected it had to do with the quality of attention that isolation produced in a room. The headset had to be passed between us when either of us needed to hear the dialogue clearly. This was a matter of necessity. This was a logistical reality. I told myself this clearly on the third day, when the first transfer happened, and I continued to tell myself variations of this in the days that followed, with the diminishing conviction of someone repeating a word until it loses its meaning. The transfer, in practice, worked like this. One of us held the headset. One of us needed it. The object had to move between two people sitting close enough that passing it was not a clear arc through empty air, but a handoff involving grip overlap, brief and functional. Vera's fingers would close around the band before mine had fully released it. Or mine would be waiting, and hers would arrive from the direction of the monitor, and the inside of my fingers would register the outer ridge of her knuckle a beat before the transfer was complete. She never broke the exchange cleanly, not once. Every time, there was a hold, not long enough to be a statement, long enough to be a fact, and then the object passed, and she would lift it to her ear, and the conversation about the work would continue as if my hand were not sitting in my lap, being quietly extraordinary about what had just happened. By the fifth evening, I had developed a careful and detailed internal vocabulary for why this was nothing. It is logistically necessary to pass the headset. We are sitting very close together. The desk is not wide. These are physical facts about a small room, not information about two people, and I am a professional with a specific and non-negotiable commitment to behaving like one. And the fact that my right hand had been noting the temperature differential between my skin and her knuckle since Tuesday was simply an occupational hazard of working at close range with someone who did not operate at a comfortable distance from anything. The crack in Vera's composure arrived on the fifth night, and it was so small I almost filed it incorrectly. We were in the third hour of a session. The footage was a close-up, a woman's face, mid-expression, the kind of expression that is not quite grief and not quite relief, but the specific human territory between them. And Vera had paused the playback at the exact frame she wanted and was making her case for why the cut should hold there, rather than 2 frames earlier. I had the headset. She finished her argument and held out her hand for it, fingers open, the way she always did. And then she stopped. Her fingers were hovering above my hand, above the headset, and she was not completing the motion. She was looking at the monitor, or she was looking at the space between her hand and mine, which from her angle might have been the same line of sight. The room was completely still. I could hear the low register hum of the monitors, continuous and textural, like the sound of thinking made audible. I did not move. I did not speak. I was aware of the very specific quality of the 3 seconds that followed, dense, pressurized, occupying more time than 3 seconds contained. And then her fingers closed around the band of the headset, not on my hand, just the band, and she lifted it to her ear and said, "Pull the cut from frame 412. Let me hear it again." 3 seconds, in Vera's economy of expression, was a confession. I did not acknowledge it. I pulled the cut from frame 412, and we worked for another hour. And when she left, she always left before me. I never knew how far she went, whether to an office somewhere else in the building or somewhere beyond it. She did not say anything that was not about the work. The notebook went into her bag. The mug, which was still half full and which I had still not seen her pour, remained on my side of the desk. I sat there for a while after the monitors had gone to sleep. I was thinking about the woman's face on the screen, the paused frame Vera had chosen. The expression on it, not grief, not relief, the specific territory between. I was thinking about how much information lived in 3 seconds. I was thinking about occupational hazards and physical facts and the temperature differential of knuckle and skin and the mounting and urgent necessity of not thinking about any of these things further. I turned off the monitors and went home. The second week arranged itself around the headset with a patience I found alarming in retrospect. Every evening followed the same structure. I arrived, the cold of the suite settled around me, the monitors came on. Vera arrived, or had already arrived. Sometimes I could not tell which. As if she existed in the room the way the monitors did, continuously, a blue-gray presence that had never not been there. We worked. The headset moved between us. My hand maintained its private and highly inconvenient record of every exchange. On the 7th evening, something shifted in the footage, and I felt it before I could name it. The close-up of the woman's face was still on the primary monitor. Vera had not moved on from it, had not taken it to picture lock, had been returning to it for 3 sessions, in a way that I had noticed and had not said anything about. In the way I was increasingly not saying anything about things that my mouth had identified as requiring careful management. But on the 7th evening, Vera played the clip before the close-up, the one that led into it, the 2 women at a kitchen table in winter light, something passing between them in the quality of the silence, and I watched it and felt the specific sensation of a frame clicking into place. I said, "It's the eyeline. The cut is correct, but the audience needs a breath before they're inside her face. 4 frames, maybe 5, of the table." Vera looked at me, not at the monitor, at me. It was not technically the first time she had looked at me. She had been looking at me regularly for a week, in the particular way she had of making eye contact a deliberate professional instrument. But this look was different in a way I could not immediately systematize, and the difference lived somewhere in the duration, slightly longer than the work required, and in a quality of stillness in her face that was not her working stillness, which I had learned, but something else, something slower. She said, "Show me." I pulled up the timeline and showed her. She watched it 3 times, her chin tilted slightly down, the strand of hair at her jaw moving when she leaned forward. On the 3rd viewing, she said, "Yes, just that." And then she picked up the notebook and wrote something, and I had the distinct and somewhat disorienting sensation that what she had written was not a timestamp. But the notebook maintained its angle, and I maintained my policy of not pursuing information I had not been offered, and we moved forward through the cut. The headset passed between us 4 more times that evening. On the 3rd transfer, I held it a half beat too long before releasing it. I did not do this on purpose. My hand made this decision without consulting the rest of me, and I became aware of it only in the moment of release, when the band left my fingers and Vera's completed the grip, and I understood that I had just said something in the language this room had apparently decided we were speaking. Vera did not acknowledge it. The notebook closed. The mug appeared on my side of the desk. I went home and I sat in my kitchen and I thought about a specific thing a professor had told me once in film school about the difference between what a frame contains and what it means. A frame contains objects and light and the geometry of bodies in space. What it means depends entirely on what came before it and what the audience is bringing in from outside the screen. The meaning is never in the frame. The meaning is in the accumulation. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about the headset, the way her fingers arrived before mine had left. The hold that lasted 1 beat longer than the logic of the transfer required. The 3 seconds on the 5th evening when her hand had hovered above mine and completed a motion she had almost not completed, and how that almost was. I understood this now, sitting in my kitchen with the overhead light on and the city outside being its own ambient and unhelpful presence. How that almost was the thing itself. Not a preamble, not a preliminary event. The thing itself, in the plainest possible language. I went to bed. The 7th night had been a Tuesday. By Thursday, I had revised my position on a number of things I had previously considered settled. The second development arrived without announcing itself as such. It arrived in the middle of a sentence about frame rate. We were 10 days in. The session had been running for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I had stopped watching the clock by then, or rather, I was watching it in the way you watch a clock when the watching is itself a form of avoidance. And we were discussing the sequence that preceded the close-up, specifically whether the frame rate in one insert shot was creating a visual discontinuity. Vera could hear more than she could see. She was speaking in the precise, minimal way she had of taking apart a problem, each clause doing exactly the work it was assigned to do, and no more. And I was watching the monitor and listening and building a counter-argument about why the discontinuity was not a flaw, but a texture that told the audience something true about the character's internal state. Vera stopped talking. Mid-clause. The sentence ended nowhere. She stopped and there was no monitor to look at in place of whatever else was happening, because she had turned, slightly, in the chair and she was looking at me. The room went very quiet. The playback loop had clicked off while she was speaking and I had not registered it, and in the silence left behind, the only sounds were the monitor's continuous low register and the specific, personal quality of the air between two people sitting at identical angles to three screens that had gone still. She was looking at me with an expression I did not have a previous category for. I had been collecting her expressions for 10 days with the thoroughness of someone building a reference library. The focused working look, the stillness of a decision being made, the micro-compression of her jaw when she heard a cut she already knew was wrong. And this expression was not in the library. It was the expression I would eventually conclude of someone who had been holding a position for a very long time and had just decided to put it down. Not abandon it, not surrender it. Simply set it on the table for a moment and see what happened next. The monitor light was on the left side of my face, cold, very slightly blue shifted, the kind of light that turns skin into something porcelain and makes shadows sit heavy. I was aware of this because I had been aware of what the light did to Vera's face for days, the way it caught the line of her jaw, the architecture beneath the skin. And now, in the specific quality of her looking at me without looking at the screen, I became aware of what it was doing to mine. This is not a comfortable kind of awareness. And then I became aware of something else. Her breath, at my right cheek, not touching, not anything approaching touching, but close enough that I could feel the thermal differential between the cool of the monitor light on my left cheek and the very faint, very controlled warmth of her exhale on my right. The contrast was specific enough to be designed. It was specific enough to feel like information. Below that, another thing. The sound of the session logging off in the background, some automated function of the software that clicked once and produced a brief tone, and in the silence after it, nothing but the monitors and the particular quality of Vera's breathing, which was slower than it had been in the preceding hour and more deliberate and audible in a way that, in Vera's particular economy of physical self-management, meant something she had not decided to show me yet. And below that, her knee. We had been sitting beside each other for 10 days in chairs whose armrests were separated by perhaps 6 inches of air. The armrests ended approximately where a person's knee begins, if that person is sitting with reasonable posture and not angled significantly toward or away from the adjacent seat. Vera's knee was against mine, not pressing, not moving. Present and deliberate, and not increasing and not withdrawing. Simply there, a point of contact through 2 layers of fabric that had apparently been installed without my body's permission and which my body was refusing to treat as neutral information. She had not moved her knee for, I counted back, at least 40 seconds. She was still looking at me. I was still looking at the monitor, which was stupid because the monitor had not been showing anything for at least 2 minutes, and I was staring at a static image of the close-up, the woman's face, mid-expression, unresolved, in a determined and increasingly unconvincing performance of professional attention. Then Vera said, "You're not watching the cut." Her voice was lower than it had been in the technical conversation, not dramatically lower. Specifically lower, a register she had not used in the preceding 2 hours and 40 minutes, and my body registered it as a physical event approximately 2 inches below my sternum before my mind had processed the sentence. I said, "Neither are you." The silence after this was different from the silences the work produced. The work produced clean silences, purposeful, dense with consideration. This silence was something else. This silence had the quality of 2 people who had just said a thing in plain language and were sitting with the plainness of it. Vera closed the notebook. She set the pen down without marking a timestamp. She looked at me for a moment that was long enough to have its own weather, and then she turned back to the monitor and said, 4 frames before the close-up. Let's build it." I pulled up the timeline. My knee was cold where hers had been. We worked for another hour. Her knee did not return to mine. I did not say anything about its absence. The absence had a location and a specific quality of alertness, that particular patch of my leg, through the fabric of my cigarette trousers. And it maintained this quality for the rest of the session and for a significant portion of my commute home, and for approximately the first 40 minutes of the following morning before I arrived at the suite and found the second chair already pulled up and the mug on my side of the desk, and the presence of both of these things meant something I could not pretend to have not understood. I set my hard drive down. I took off my jacket. I sat in my chair. I thought, I'm in trouble. I thought it with the clarity and lack of dramatics of someone who has arrived at a conclusion through evidence rather than feeling. And then I opened the project file, and Vera arrived 7 minutes later, and we said good morning, and we worked. The work was good. The work was, in fact, exceptional. The kind of collaborative rhythm that most editors spend careers hoping to find and rarely do, where the other person's instinct and your own arrive at the same place from different directions and meet without collision. Vera had a quality of attention that made the footage mean more than it had before she looked at it. I told myself this was the reason the room had its particular charge. I told myself this with diminishing success. 13 days in. The third development was slower than the first two and more deliberate, and I watched it arrive the way you watch weather coming in from the water. You can see it from far enough away that you have time to think about what to do, and you stand there thinking, and then you are standing in it. The session had been running for 3 hours. It was close to 11 in the evening. The city had gone from its daytime hum to the lighter frequency of late night. Fewer vehicles, more intermittent, a different acoustic texture through the sealed glass. The rest of the building had been empty for 2 hours at least. It was the two of us and the monitors and the footage, which had been, for the past hour, the sequence immediately preceding the close-up. Vera had returned to the question of the insert, whether to include it, and we had been going back and forth with the specific and generative friction of two people who trust each other's instincts enough to push against them. She reached across me to adjust the monitor angle. This was a practical action. The monitor angle required adjustment. Her arm came across the space in front of me, the left monitor, my side of the desk, and her forearm pressed along mine for the duration of the adjustment, fabric on skin, and she did not rush it. 4 seconds. 5. The monitor settled at the angle she wanted. Her forearm did not leave mine. I looked at the monitor. She looked at the monitor. 6 seconds. 7. The warmth of her forearm through the sleeve of her jacket was a fact that my skin was cataloging in considerable detail, specifically noting the weight of it, heavier than the contact required, present with intention, and the slight roughness of the fabric where the sleeve had ridden up slightly toward the wrist and the actual surface of her skin, very warm, was in contact with the outer edge of my forearm, perhaps 2 inches above the wrist. She still had not moved her arm. I became aware, in the precise way that awareness arrives in the body before it arrives in the mind, that something in the room had changed its configuration, not the monitors, not the desk, the air. The specific pressure and temperature of the air at a distance of perhaps 12 inches, which had been one thing for 3 hours and was now, without announcement, something else. Denser, warmer, a physical fact I could not attribute to the ventilation system. Vera took off her jacket. She did this with her arm still against mine. She did not move away to do it. She simply reached with her free hand and drew the jacket off her shoulders, and reached it behind her and set it across the back of her chair. And the motion required a kind of close-quarter maneuvering that meant, for approximately 3 seconds, her face was considerably closer to my right shoulder than it had been. I could smell her perfume at that proximity, cedar and cold linen, a scent I had registered on the first day and filed in the category of professional information, and had been retrieving from that category with increasing frequency. And beneath it, at this distance and in this warmth, something else, something that was skin and the specific warmth of a person who had been working in a concentrated way for 3 hours in a sealed room. She settled back, jacket over the chair. The collar of her shirt was open at 2 buttons. She had been wearing it closed when she arrived, and the black silk bra was visible at the neckline, architectural, the deep plunge of it drawing a line from the base of her throat. The arm returned to its position against mine, as if it had not left, as if this were a place the arm had decided to be and saw no reason to revise. My blouse had come untucked at the left side. I had not noticed this. I became aware of it in the way I was apparently becoming aware of a number of things, through Vera's attention reaching it before mine did. Her gaze moved, briefly and without apology, to the gap at my waist where the ivory blouse had separated from the waistband of my trousers, and the blush lace of the bralette was visible through the gap, not dramatically but unambiguously. I registered this with my peripheral vision. I registered Vera registering it. I reached to tuck it back in. Vera said, "Don't fix it." 2 words, quiet as a timestamp, which was to say, exact, certain, and already logged. I lowered my hand. I looked at the monitor. The close-up of the woman's face, still there, still paused, still holding that expression between grief and relief, watched both of us without opinion. Vera's forearm was warm against mine. The cedar and linen of her perfume was present in the air between us at a density I had not previously encountered in professional spaces. And the silk bra was visible in my peripheral vision with an architectural clarity that my peripheral vision had apparently decided to treat as essential information. My breathing was faster than the situation warranted. Not dramatically, specifically, Vera said, "And stop watching my hands if you're not going to say anything about it." There was a long pause, the kind that has weight, the kind that sits between 2 people and does not apologize for itself. I said, "I'm watching the footage." Vera said, "You're watching my hands." I was watching her hands. I had been watching her hands for 2 weeks with the thoroughness of a woman who has been telling herself she is doing something else. The hands were long-fingered, precise, the kind of hands that touch things with intention, the pen, the notebook, the headset, the desk, and I had a detailed and increasingly problematic internal record of what they looked like in motion. She turned her chair toward me, not away from the monitors, toward me, the chair rotating perhaps 45 degrees until she was facing my collarbone, which placed her at a particular angle relative to me. Leaning forward, elbow on knee, face at the level of my collarbone, looking up at me. The chair arms no longer aligned. Our forearms were no longer aligned. We were at different angles now, and her face was, I calculated this without trying to, approximately a foot below mine and tilted up. And the monitor light reached her differently from this position, catching the underneath of her jaw and the sharp line of it. And the strand of hair at her jaw was very close to where her cheek met the collar of her shirt. She looked up at me. She had the precise patience in her face and her body and the arrangement of herself in the chair of someone who has already made the decision and is waiting for the other person to catch up. Not impatiently, not pressing. Simply, here, still, certain. The warmth of where her forearm had been was still present on my skin like an afterimage, that 2 inches above my wrist, that 2 inches of contact. And the absence of it was a physical event with a specific location and quality. The skin there stayed alert, a faint and stubborn awareness. Not unpleasant, not anything I could responsibly call neutral. I did not move. I was aware of my own breathing in the way you become aware of it when it has become something that requires management. The room was completely quiet. The monitors hummed. Vera's exhale was audible at this proximity, slow, controlled, and more present than the ventilation justified. I could feel the warmth of it at my collarbone, below the open collar of my blouse, and my skin registered this as a category of information I had run out of professional justifications for. She was still looking up at me. I said, in a voice that was admirably even given the circumstances. "You're doing something," Vera said. "Yes." Another pause. Dense, pressurized, full of what neither of us was saying. I said, "The footage isn't going to cut itself," Vera said, still looking up, still patient, still entirely in command of whatever this was. "No, it isn't." She did not move. I did not move. The monitor continued its low register. The city continued its late-night frequency through the sealed glass. The paused frame on the primary monitor, the woman's face, the expression between grief and relief, held its position in the bright, still rectangle of its moment, waiting. I picked up the pen from the desk. I set it down. I looked at the monitor. I looked at my hands, which had decided to grip the armrests of my chair and were doing so with a conviction that was beginning to feel metaphorical. I said, "I think we should run the playback from the kitchen sequence." Vera said, "Do you?" It was not a question. Nothing Vera said in that register was a question. I said, "Yes." She said, "All right." She turned back toward the monitors. She reached forward and opened the timeline and pulled up the kitchen sequence and hit play. And for the next 40 minutes, we watched footage and made notes and spoke in complete sentences about technical things. And the mug was on my side of the desk, and the headset sat between us, and I did not touch it, and she did not offer it. And when the session ended, she said goodnight and picked up the notebook and her jacket and left, and I sat in the blue-gray of the monitors for a long time after, watching the woman's face in the paused frame. the expression between grief and relief. I thought, that is what it looks like to be entirely aware of something, and to be choosing, very deliberately, not to arrive at it yet. I thought that was a useful thing to understand. I turned off the monitors. I went home. I stood in my kitchen and I thought about what Vera had said. Don't fix it. And the specific quality of the two words, and where in my chest they had landed, and the fact that they were still there. Those two words, sitting in a specific location below the sternum with the stubborn, settled weight of something that had been correctly placed. I went to bed. I did not sleep particularly well. The following evening, she pulled up the close-up before I had taken off my jacket and said, I want to talk about what she's doing with her eyes. And I sat down and we talked about it, and then we talked about the cut, and then we worked, and the headset passed between us, her fingers, my knuckles, the hold that lasted one beat longer than the transfer required. And I was aware that my body had organized itself in a specific way around this room and this woman and these evenings. In the particular way a body does when it has accepted something the mind is still itemizing objections to. The 15th evening was a Friday. I know this because I arrived thinking it was Thursday and found the building quieter than usual. A Friday quality to the emptiness. Less residual from the day, more complete. The kind of silence that comes when people have decided to be gone rather than simply departed. The monitors were on, the second chair was positioned at its angle. The mug was on my side of the desk. Vera arrived at 7:40, 7 minutes later than the previous evenings, and she was carrying 2 cups from somewhere in the building. She set one down on her side. I had never seen her do this before. It was always the mug, appearing and disappearing without observable process. And the other on mine, and she said nothing about it. Just sat down, opened the notebook, and said, I want to run from the beginning of the second act. Start at the dinner table. I started at the dinner table. We ran through the second act in full, and it was 2 hours of precise and generative work, and I was genuinely and unambiguously good at this. Good at the rhythm of it, good at the instinct for where the cut wanted to go, good at identifying where Vera's vision and the footage were not yet in alignment and finding the adjustment that served both. She knew I was good at it. She had known on the first day, you cut the Aldrich film, and I know, and that is why you are here. But there was a different quality to how she received my instincts on the 15th evening, a quietness to her agreement when she agreed, something that was not professional evaluation. At the end of the second act, she sat back in her chair and looked at the monitor and said, the close-up. I said, we keep coming back to it. She said, yes. I said, why haven't you locked it? She looked at me. She said, because I'm not done with it yet. There was a pause. I considered asking what she was not done with, and I decided against it on the grounds that I already knew, and that knowing and asking were different things, and one of them required me to accept that I knew, which was a thing I was apparently still in the process of negotiating. I looked at the monitor, the woman's face, mid-expression. 3 sessions, maybe 4, I had lost count, in which Vera had returned to this frame and held it at the edge of its own meaning and not cut away from it. I said, she's deciding. Vera said, what is she deciding? I said, whether to say it. A long pause, not uncomfortable, dense. Vera said, and does she? I said, I don't know yet. That's what we're trying to figure out. Vera looked at me for a moment with that expression I had not initially had a category for, the one that was not in the working library, the one that was the expression of someone who has put something down. And then she said, yes, that's exactly what we're trying to figure out. She wrote something in the notebook. She closed it. She picked up her cup. I picked up mine. We drank coffee in a room that was charged with every specific thing we were not saying, and the woman on the monitor held her expression between grief and relief, and neither of us looked away. The 16th evening was a Saturday. I had not expected to be called in. Vera texted at 2 p.m. The text said only a time and the word sweet. And I came, because of course I came. And I told myself this was because the work was at a critical juncture, which was true, and told myself this was only because of the work, which was a thing I had stopped fully believing somewhere around the 9th or 10th day, but was maintaining as a kind of structural fiction, because the alternative required me to do something with what I actually believed. She was already there, not standing at the window this time, sitting in her chair, jacket off, the notebook open, one hand braced at the edge of the desk. She looked up when I came in, and she said, close the door. I closed the door. She said, sit down. I sat down. The monitors were running the close-up on loop, the 3 seconds of the woman's face, cycling, the expression between grief and relief, repeating with the patient insistence of something that intended to be understood. I watched it for a moment. The room had its particular quality, blue-gray, cold coffee, city hum through sealed glass. And beneath it, Vera's cedar and linen, present and immediate. She said, "I want to know what you think she's saying." I said, "In the scene?" Vera looked at me. She said, "No." I looked at the monitor. The woman's face cycled. 3 seconds. Again. I sat with the question for a moment, with the plainness of what Vera was asking, which was very plain, and the plainness of what I wanted to say, which was equally plain, and the considerable distance between the two. I said, "I think she is saying that she has been trying to stay on her side of it, and she is not sure she can anymore." Vera was very still. I said, "I think she is saying that she was not planning this. I think she is saying that it happened anyway, and she is not. She is not going to perform a version of herself that pretends it didn't." Vera looked at me for a long time. The monitors cycled. The woman's face, mid-expression, mid-decision, watching us from its 3-second loop. Then Vera picked up the headset from the desk and held it out. I reached for it. Her fingers did not close before mine had released it. She waited. She actually waited until I had a grip on the band, and then she closed her fingers around it, around the band and around my fingers both, and held, not moving, not speaking. Her fingers around mine, the headset between us as a kind of formal pretext for a grip that had nothing to do with the headset, and the pressure of her fingers was warm and exact and absolutely still. She said, "Play it." I said, "Play what?" She said, very quietly, not looking away. "Whatever you want to." I held the headset. I held her fingers holding the headset. The monitors cycled, the city hummed. I made a decision, not forced, genuinely chosen, the first unambiguously active decision I had made in 16 days of receiving and responding and declining to name. And I set the headset down, between us on the desk, and I left my fingers under hers. She looked at the headset. She looked at my hand, she looked at my face, and in her face was the expression that was not in the library, the one that was not grief and not relief. And then she said, so quietly, it almost had no register, "Cass." My name in her voice was a physical event with a specific location, and I chose to stop pretending otherwise. The 17th evening was not a workday. I arrived at the suite at 8 because she had asked me to, and she was standing at the window with her back to the door the way she had been on the first day, and she did not turn around when I came in. But this time she said, "I know you're there." And the quality of it was entirely different from the first day's sit, I'll get to you. It was, in its particular and careful register, a kind of tenderness, which in Vera was a thing so specific and so rare that it arrived with the force of a formal announcement. I said, "I know you know." She turned around. She was wearing the black tailored suit without the jacket, just the shirt, open at 3 buttons, the architectural black silk visible at the neckline. The chignon had loosened on one side. She looked for the first time in 17 days like a person who had been somewhere difficult and had decided to stop traveling. She looked at me. She said, "Sit." I said, "I've been sitting for 16 days. Something happened at the edge of her mouth. Not a smile, or not only a smile, something that was closer to a recognition. She said, "Yes, you have." She walked toward me, not to the chair, not to the desk. To me, directly, and she stood close enough that the cedar and cold linen of her perfume was unmediated, present, and dense, and the particular warmth of her, a person at close range, warm from the room, was something my skin catalogued without being asked. She raised her right hand, and she took the strand of hair that had come loose from my arrangement over the course of the day, and she moved it, not tucked behind my ear, nothing so finished as that. She simply moved it out of the way, 2 fingers at my temple, drawing it back, and her fingertips rested for a moment against the side of my face above the ear, not pressing, just present, and then they did not leave. I said, "Vera?" She said, "I know." She said it with the precision of someone who had, in fact, known for considerably longer than 17 days, and who had decided, on this specific evening, to be done with the particular discipline of not arriving at what she knew. Her hand was at my face. Not quite cupping, the heel of her palm at my jaw, 2 fingers at my temple, her thumb resting below my cheekbone with the exact and considered pressure of something she had thought about. I could feel my own pulse in the places where she was touching me, a biological fact my cardiovascular system had apparently decided she should have access to. The monitor light was on us both. cold, blue-tinged, washing everything into the narrow territory between shadow and clarity. And in it, her face was very close and very still, and in her eyes was something I had not been able to read for 17 days, and could now. I said, "The notebook," she said. "What about it?" I said. "What have you been writing in it?" She looked at me for a moment. Then she reached into her jacket on the chair back without moving the rest of herself. Minimal, economical, entirely in character. And she set the notebook on the desk beside us and opened it. Not to the beginning. To a page somewhere in the middle, and on the page, in her small and previously unreadable handwriting, were timestamps, the way there always were, and beside some of them, not all, but some, brief annotations. I read the one she had opened to. It said, 1942. Holds the headset, 1 beat past the transfer. Does not look up. Below that, 2017. She saw me stop. She decided not to say anything about it. That one took something. And below that, at the bottom of the page, no timestamp. She is going to figure it out. She already has. She's choosing when. I looked at that for a while. I said, "You've been watching me figure it out." She said, "Yes," I said. "And you weren't going to say anything," she said, and the register was the quietest I had heard from her, the most internal. "I was going to give you time." I looked at her. I said, "How much time were you planning to give me?" She said, "As much as you needed." She said it without irony, without qualification, with the plain and specific sincerity of someone who had looked at a person and decided that the person was worth waiting for, which in Vera's particular and precise vocabulary was, I understood, the most direct thing she had ever said to me. More direct than any of it. The headset, the knee, the forearm, the don't fix it, the precise and sustained patience of a woman who had made a decision and was giving another person the room to make hers. I put my hand up and I held her hand against my face. She breathed in, not dramatically. Specifically, the controlled intake of someone allowing themselves something they had been not allowing. I said, "Okay," she said. "Okay." Neither of us moved for a moment. The room held us in its blue-gray and its city hum and its smell of cold coffee and cedar and the particular warmth of two people who had stopped pretending to be at a professional distance. The monitors were on. The woman's face was on the primary monitor, mid-expression, cycling. Then Vera said, "I'm going to do something now." I said, "All right," she said. "Tell me to stop if you want me to stop." I said, "I know." She moved. The first thing she did was not a sweep or a gesture. The first thing she did was lower her forehead to mine, barely touching, the heat of her skin and the heat of mine finding each other across perhaps a millimeter of air, and hold there, not speaking, not moving, breathing. I could feel her breath against my mouth from this proximity, warm and steady and slower than it had been, and I could feel the specific quality of her stillness, which was not the stillness of restraint, but the stillness of presence. She was here, and she was letting me feel that she was here, and neither of us was pretending to be anything else. I said her name, just Vera. Her breath went wrong. I felt it, the specific disruption of an exhale that had been controlled and then was not, the catch in it, the very small and involuntary sound at the end of it that she had not intended me to hear, and that I heard with a precision that went directly into the base of my sternum and stayed there. Her grip on the desk edge changed. Her whole body changed. Not dramatically, not a collapse, nothing so legible as that. It was the specific shift of someone who has been, until that moment, in command of every variable, and who has allowed one variable to move that they had not planned to move. Not lost control, not that. Chosen, in this specific and irrevocable moment, to release it. Her hand, the one that had been at my face, at my jaw, the heel of the palm and the thumb below the cheekbone, moved, not away. The hand moved from my jaw to the side of my neck, to the specific territory below the ear where the skin is thin and the pulse is loud, and her thumb rested there, not pressing, just present over the pulse, and I felt my own heartbeat in her hand. She looked at me. From this distance, looking was not a neutral activity. It was a physical event with location and duration and specific weight, and it was located approximately in the center of my chest, and it was pressing, gently, with a precision that her hands might have been too direct for. She said, against my mouth and not yet reaching it, "Tell me when you stop pretending this is an accident." The cold of the desk edge was against my back. I had shifted without noticing, and the edge of the desk was at my spine, the corner of the desk precisely where the lower vertebrae meet, and the cold of it, through the fabric of my blouse, was the exact and deliberate contrast to the warmth of her from the front. And I held both of those things, the cold and the warmth, for a single second of suspension in which the clock in the room appeared to have stopped operating. I said, I stopped pretending about it on the 5th night. Her forehead still against mine, her thumb over my pulse, her breath, which had been disrupted, and was now not controlled, not resumed, but something else, something that was the sound of a person breathing without management, without the specific discipline of a woman who had arranged everything in her life, including time itself, to serve her. She said, The 5th night. I said, When you stopped. She said, I said, I know. She moved her face, not away. She moved her face from the position of forehead to the position of her mouth at my cheek, below the temple, and the warmth of her mouth against that specific surface was... It was not something I had a prior category for. The way several things about Vera turned out not to have prior categories. It was warm. It was specific. It was held there with the same quality of stillness she had brought to every other moment in this room. The stillness of someone who had decided and was executing the decision with complete attention. I stopped pretending to grip the armrests. My hands, which had been maintaining their position on the chair arms, with the conviction of women who have made very firm architectural commitments, let go. My hands were not at my sides for long. The paused frame on the monitor, the woman's face, mid-expression, was still there. I registered it in my peripheral vision, the bright, still rectangle of it, and for a moment the expression it held ceased to be ambiguous. From this angle, in this light, at this specific moment in the room, I understood it. It was not grief and not relief. It was the expression of someone who has been at the edge of something for a very long time and has just stepped into it. And the stepping is not loss, not relief, the specific and irreversible fact of having done a thing that cannot be undone, and finding that it is exactly what it needed to be. Vera's mouth was at my throat. Her other hand, the one that had been at the desk, was at my waist, palm flat against the small of my back from the front now, through the fabric of my untucked blouse, not asking. I had stopped pretending a very long time ago. She said, mouth still against skin. Hold still. I said, approximately. I'm trying. She said, 1 beat later, mouth moving lower to the sternum, the architectural black silk visible in my peripheral vision, and her hair loose on one side, and the chignon almost entirely undone. Tell me when you stop pretending this is an accident. I said, I told you. 5th night. Her breath against my sternum, warm, controlled, deliberate. One specific and suspended second. Then she said, so quietly it was almost only breath, I stopped pretending on the 3rd day. The silence after that was the silence of 2 people holding something that had been named at last. The monitors hummed. The city moved outside the sealed glass, its low and consistent frequency. The woman's face on the primary monitor held her expression in its bright rectangle, unresolved and resolved simultaneously, the way some true things are. My hands had found the loose side of her chignon. The pins were not many, 3 I counted later by their absence, and they came out without drama, and her hair fell, and it was not the controlled severity of the low chignon. It was just her hair, and she pressed her face into the side of my neck and breathed. That was the moment. Not the desk, not the headset. That was the moment. Her face pressed into my neck and breathing, and my hand in her hair, and the monitors cycling, and the city outside. In the morning, I arrived to find the 2nd chair already pulled up beside the editing station, angled toward mine, the same angle as always, 2 people facing the same direction. On my side of the desk, the mug, still warm. I set my hard drive down. I took off my jacket. I sat. On the desk, between the mug and the headset, was the notebook. Open. I looked at it. She had written something on the last page, below all the timestamps and annotations, in the same small handwriting I had finally learned to read. It said, 2317. And beside it, 2 words, worth it. I read the notebook. I closed it. I set the headset on my side of the desk. Vera arrived at 8 minutes past 8, which was the latest she had ever arrived, and she was carrying 2 cups again, And she set one down on her side of the desk and one down on mine. And she sat in the second chair and she said, "Where were we?" I said, "The close-up." She looked at the monitor. The woman's face was there, cycling in its 3-second loop, mid-expression, the territory between what it had been and what it was going to be. Vera said, "Are we ready to cut it?" I considered that. I said, "I think so," she said, looking at the monitor and then at me. And in her voice, the very precise and controlled warmth of something she had decided not to keep at a temperature. "Tell me where." I put my hand over hers on the desk. I turned to the monitor. I said, "Here, exactly here, don't cut away." She looked at the screen. She said, "Yes, that's it." She wrote a timestamp in the notebook. She closed it. Her hand turned over under mine and her fingers closed around my fingers, and neither of us looked away from the cut.